Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. There was an interesting clip that was circling around on social media from what I believe to be Jarviis Landry and Leonard Fournette's podcast, talking about them and Deshaun Watson potentially meeting up and linking up to play in Atlanta. And there were a lot of interesting reactions to this, right? Some people saying, damn, wish it could have happened. Some people saying that this confirms one theory or another. I don't know how much new information there is about what's said in this clip other than like Jarviis and Leonard were involved with whatever move would have happened with Deshaun in Atlanta, because we know that Deshaun was probably going to go to the Atlanta Falcons. We've known that since before the trade was official. Remember the leaked picture of the Deshaun Watson Falcons jersey that was released before the trade was finalized. There were rumors that Deshaun was going to sign with the Atlanta Falcons, that he was going to go to the Atlanta Falcons, probably because of noise being made of Deshaun trying to recruit people to play with him in Atlanta. And then suddenly he signs with Cleveland. This is why most people heavily believe, and I think they're right to speculate this, that the move for Deshaun Watson was heavily influenced by ownership, because ownership is the only person who could have made that kind of deal that quickly with the amount of authority that the Browns made to deal with, right? Andrew Berry could not make that deal. And again, the smoking gun on how Deshaun Watson got here and who truly pulled the trigger at the end of the day to get Deshaun Watson, it speaks volumes that they haven't fired anybody. And the reason they haven't fired anybody, I think, is fairly obvious. I don't know why everybody asks this question like there isn't an answer. But the reason everybody wasn't fired, because the guy who made the decision, the guy who was willing to do what was necessary to get Deshaun Watson, well, that guy owns the team. He's Jimmy Haslam. He's the only guy who could have done that. Andrew Berry does not have the authority to do that. Kevin Stefanski does not have the authority to do that. Whether they encourage him to make that decision or not, at the end of the day, Jimmy's the one who dropped the bag because Jimmy wanted to drop the bag, and that's why nobody got fired over it. None of this stuff about Watson is as mysterious as some people make it out to be. All it takes is like 10 minutes of really thinking about it. But this clip did come across my timeline. It is a long clip, so I'm going to let it play out in its entirety. But we're going to talk about this because I think there are other takeaways that I don't think I've seen a lot of people come away with from this video that I think are just as interesting as the takeaways about the Cleveland Browns.
Bro, we have a crazy-ass story. Deshaun Watson. So listen, this young man texted me and said, we have a big play right now.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, well, I'm working out right now. Call me in about 30 minutes.
Yep.
So we could discuss this, right?
Yeah.
It is me, Mr. Jarviis Landry, and Deshaun Watson on the phone.
On FaceTime.
On group FaceTime. Deshaun's like, I'm thinking about going to Atlanta. I'm like, oh shit, that's right there. That's perfect.
Yeah, like home.
That's perfect. So I'm like, all right, well, listen, say, brother, keep us in touch.
Mm-hmm.
Let us know what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we signed there. Yeah. I know you kind of went at it with your agent. Like, all right, he signed up the money you was going to get.
Yeah.
And I was going at it with my agent. If he signed up the money I was going to get.
Yeah.
Can you please explain to the people what happened? Like, how he just, like I say, listen, it's a business, so it's about you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But he made the decision that was best for him. But my man left us high and dry.
Yeah,
I wanted to cry.
Yeah, man.
I should be a rapper, huh?
Man.
High and dry, I wanted to cry. Man, tell him the story, bro. Tell him the story.
I don't. To be able to walk somebody through here, to be able to walk somebody through this situation, right? It's complicated in a way because, like you say, like you always want people to make decisions based on their family, their situation, right? But as men, also we want people to hold up to their word, right?
True.
So
True.
It was a situation where, all right, so look, I get a call one day from a random number. I didn't answer the phone. I get a text. And it was like, yo, it's D4.
Yeah.
And I'm like, D4?
That D4L.
All right, I'm like, D4. So I answer the phone. So I call him back, answer the phone, FaceTime, and it's Deshaun. I think he got one of his like quarterback coach or one of his friends in like a hotel room or whatever it is. Obviously at that time, he's hot in the media, being that, you know, his case got dropped and, you know, that stuff settled and his return to the league is like, it's happening, right? So we talked for like 15 minutes about Atlanta.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, man, I'm like, yeah, bro, I'm with it.
Yeah.
I'm like, I know somebody else that probably with it too, which is you.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I think Leonard Fournette will be with it too. So he was like, well, let's start a group text.
Yeah.
So we started a group text. Now, mind y'all, I'm on the phone at this point for the next like 3 or 4 days, every day with Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith at the time is the OC head coach there, so he calling all the plays. So I'm talking, he telling me how, you know, he gonna be using me and this and that and the third. So I'm about to get ready to book a flight. I'm talking to my agent in on it too. My agent kind of like, you know, he's like, man, it could be a great play. Deshaun obviously had an amazing career in Houston.
For sure.
Right. And then, you know, he went through his things, right? And now he's back. It could be a great opportunity to really get the ball in your hands. It's nothing like having a secure guy for him to throw the ball to, right? So we talk on the phone. I'm like, look, I'm about to book a flight to Atlanta. We even planned where we were gonna have dinner at in Atlanta. And I wake up the next day, bags packed at the door. Driver coming through the gate. Breaking news. Deshaun Watson signed Cleveland Browns, $256 million fully guaranteed.
I called ASAP. I said, what the fuck? I said, hold up. What did he supposed to let us know?
Man.
And don't get me wrong, I was a little upset with you, but I understand the business side, right? But he did text us and apologize.
Yep.
You know, man, I should have better communicated on his behalf and shit. I appreciated that. You know what I'm saying? It meant a lot. But Atlanta Falcons, what if?
I don't know about y'all, but the first thing when I saw that clip, like in its entirety, right? Because you see little bits of it on social media. One thing that shocked me, or not shocked me, but stood out to me, was how disconnected they feel. It felt like they are from the reality, because like you hear them talk about this almost Deshaun Watson in Atlanta situation as if it's something that the people in Atlanta wish they would have seen. Like as if it's like, damn, y'all almost had Deshaun Watson. Could you imagine if you had Deshaun Watson, Leonard Fournette, and Jarvis Landry in 2022? As if that would have been a good thing. Like, let's be real about the reality of Jarvis Landry's career at that point. He had a couple of down years, and then in 2022, I mean, that was his last year in the league. And that's when he would have theoretically played with Deshaun in Atlanta. So I don't know how useful he would have been. And then you look at Leonard Fournette, and his career was on a similar path to Jarvis Landry's on his way out the league at around that same time. So you couple that with trading for Deshaun Watson, and that's a disaster, right? If your core is like Jarvis Landry, Leonard Fournette, and Deshaun Watson in 2022, that's not a good core. I mean, like we saw what their guys' career was after that. Maybe you could make the argument that Deshaun's career would have been drastically different in Atlanta versus Cleveland, but they just mentioned it. Arthur Smith was the head coach. And guess what? Arthur Smith's system in Atlanta at that time, it's not that different from Kevin's system. So all this stuff that Deshaun struggled to transition to in Cleveland, it would have been the same exact way with Arthur Smith, right? Like they're both wide zone, Shanahan style head coaches. Like they both run very similar systems. There's overlap there, a ton of overlap there in things that guys succeed with, the type of quarterbacks that succeed and the type of quarterbacks that don't succeed. So this idea that like, oh man, like they're talking about this as if Deshaun's career was derailed somehow just by going to Cleveland instead of Deshaun's career being derailed because for whatever reason, Deshaun just was not as good at football when he came back from that 700-day hiatus. Maybe because he didn't play football for 700 days, which he's coming off another 700-day hiatus. Maybe because he had to deal with the change in perception, which I believe is heavily involved with the reason he hasn't looked as confident as he's looked in Houston and Cleveland, because in Houston, he was a golden boy. Everybody looked up to Deshaun as this humble, religious man who was morally righteous. And then he gets traded to Cleveland after, and by the way, this is a quick aside, my favorite game to play when athletes talk about Deshaun Watson is seeing how they like skirt around the 30 allegations of sexual assault. Because they, like every athlete, no matter how real they keep it, right? No matter how real they claim to keep it or how they talk real, all of a sudden turns into a top flight politician when it's time to mention them cases, right? You know, they get around, he's going through the current situation of the thing that he was going through. He's going through the current, the legal predicament that he was in at the time. He's going through, the specific cases that I cannot comment on at this time. Like they turn in, they turn into corporate PR people. Like the instant anybody mentions the cases, any of the women that were allegedly harmed by Deshaun Watson, we can't speak on that at the time. We have to talk about, like it's the funniest thing. Jarviis Landry in that clip, he references the 30 cases of, well, at the time, 22 cases, I think, of sexual assault allegations that Deshaun Watson was facing at the time, and that he did not get indicted by a grand jury to be arrested, but still was facing suspension from the NFL, but was going to return to the NFL. That all gets wrapped up in he was going through a situation. When I get the flu and I can't do the show for a week, that's a situation. If I got charged for 24 cases of alleged sexual assault, I think that's a little bit more than a situation. But that's my favorite game to play when it comes to Deshaun. Is like, how do people try to like skirt around the severity of what he was accused of? Whether you believe he did it or not, the severity of what he was accused of is significant. But anyways, a number of things could have affected Deshaun's play. The fact of the matter is who he was in 2020 versus who he was in 2022. Completely different players, right? Again, it could have had something to do with just being off for 700 days, which unfortunately Deshaun Watson is priming to come back off another 700-day layoff. Maybe it was because he went from being seen as this respectable, religious, inspirational figure to being associated with sexual assault in a way that most people don't experience, right? Like in a way that, people call you nasty. People know your business, or at least the business is out there and alleged seriously enough to where people have made up their decisions about it, right? So that's what Deshaun, I think, has gone through. He went from being seen as one way, and then some of the stuff that he was allegedly into got put into the light, and now that affects his confidence. I mean, like that would affect a lot of people's confidence, I would imagine. Never ended up being the same. That stuff happens, by the way, whether he comes to Cleveland or Atlanta. I think the only difference is like Cleveland was not going to be as warm to Deshaun Watson and ended up not being that patient for Deshaun Watson because all they knew about him was that he was supposed to be a franchise guy and he was replacing somebody with Baker Mayfield who some of the Browns fan base legitimately believed was a franchise guy. Now, there was a lot of Browns fans at the time who did not believe that Baker Mayfield was a franchise guy. And I think history, or at least how people tell history, has made people act like that wasn't a reasonable opinion to have. But I was there in 2021. It was a reasonable opinion to have about Baker Mayfield, that he wasn't a franchise quarterback. And yeah, there were some of the fan base that were eager to replace him. There were some of the fan base that weren't. But there was a split audience here for Deshaun Watson. You add that on top of there's no connection to him. He didn't play high school here. He didn't play college football here. He didn't have any other connection other than like he beat the Buckeyes a couple of times while he was at Clemson. And you're already not going to have the most goodwill to begin with. You parlay that into how he played, and then boom, you get how the reaction has been towards Deshaun Watson. And look, I've been through a lot with this whole Watson era. You know, when it was popular to just not give it a chance, I gave it a chance for multiple years on this channel. I was like the only person in Cleveland willing to be fair to Deshaun. The play has gotten to the point to where being fair is just going to be negative about Deshaun because that's what the reality is. But before that was clearly the case in 2024, I was giving him opportunity and trying to just judge him based off his play as a football player. And that was not what a lot of people in Cleveland wanted to hear at that time, right? And maybe that did affect things for Deshaun. I mean, like from what I hear from people who have worked with Deshaun in Houston is that Deshaun is somebody who likes to be liked, who needs to be liked. And not only is he in a situation where most of the country isn't a fan of him, but he gets traded to a team in a city that is the least likely to embrace him. I think it's interesting that Cleveland ended up being in the top 3. And I think at the time, Cleveland was in the top 3 simply because Cleveland in 2020, not 2020, 2022, you got to remember, seemed like the best possible place to go roster-wise to win a championship. That was the edge that Cleveland had. The other 2 teams were Carolina, who had the connection to Clemson, although it's kind of complicated because, you know, Carolina represents both North and South Carolina, and there's a lot of anti-Clemson fans, maybe even more anti-Clemson fans in the Carolinas than just Clemson fans, but there's still Clemson fans there, right? Like you have a hive, a local hive for you in Carolina. Then you have Atlanta, where Deshaun's from, where he played high school football, where he has the story about being a Make-A-Wish kid with Warwick Dunn, another Falcons legend. And although Atlanta is not South Carolina, although Atlanta is not in the Carolinas, for anybody who spent any amount of time in the city, you know that Atlanta and the Carolinas are closely connected. There's a lot of people from the Carolinas who are in Atlanta. It's a high percentage of the population, right? You drive around Atlanta, I promise you're going to see a bunch of South Carolina license plates. It's a very connected population. So there's a good chance that even some of that Clemson love would have helped him in Atlanta. I think that would have been the big difference for Deshaun in Atlanta. He would have had a bigger base of support from his home team than he did in Cleveland. Cleveland, they never liked him. He replaced somebody who was popular, and then he wasn't immediately good. So then he felt like a disappointment, and he never recovered from that, right? There were a couple glimpses here where it felt like the fans would turn around on him, but it never happened. In Atlanta, he would have never had to fight that battle. And maybe not having to fight that battle makes a great deal of difference for Deshaun Watson. But either way, that's too much of a difference based on too small of a thing to just assume that that's going to change. I wanted to talk about this video because I think it's a good lens to kind of talk about and dissect what went wrong with Deshaun Watson. Because if you listen to people, you know, some people will throw all the blame on one thing. Oh, Kevin Stefanski's system didn't fit Deshaun Watson. He should have went to Atlanta. Well, that wouldn't have changed in Atlanta, right? I think the thing that would have changed in Atlanta was the off-the-field situation, the amount of off-the-field support that Deshaun would have had in Atlanta amongst some of the fans. There certainly would have been a bigger portion of the fan base willing to embrace Deshaun Watson than if he had went to, well, not if, then when he had went to Cleveland. There's no doubt in my mind. And I think that does make a difference given what reportedly we know about Deshaun Watson. But is it a big enough difference to change the fact that nationally how he's viewed does not change in Atlanta? That how he's covered nationally does not change if he's in Atlanta. See, the biggest issues for Deshaun Watson while I was covering him as a starting quarterback here in Cleveland, they weren't from the local media. Yeah, there were some people who didn't like Deshaun Watson in the local media. Some people not willing to give him a fair chance. Some people who would jump on him. But that's not the stuff that it seemed like bothered Watson or the Watson camp. The stuff that felt like it bothered them was the national stuff. was how he was being talked about on the broadcast, which does not change, which is a huge part of what we've gone through with Deshaun. On top of the fact that he is seemingly physically aged faster than anticipated, which happens, right? Cam Newton was out of there by the time he was like, 33? Some people just age faster. Some people age slower. Some people age more gracefully. It doesn't seem like Deshaun Watson was one of those people who was going to age gracefully. Seemed like he was one of them people whose body was going to shut down quick on him. And it kind of makes sense when you think about what the lore of Deshaun Watson was. See, you got to remember how Deshaun Watson was viewed before the trade, before the allegations. He was viewed as this guy who will play through anything. Well, when you're that kind of guy who plays through broken ribs, who plays through injuries, who no-sells this and no-sells that, guess what? A bill gets due physically. You play with the broken rib, you're going to create some damage long term. You play with broken ankles, all this stuff that he played with, because his toughness was one of his most marketable and his best traits as a football player, which I am not going to shit on. Like, I think even in Cleveland, he's displayed remarkable physical toughness. He played with a broken shoulder to finish a game, but that has a cost physically. And that tends to make you age a little bit faster. That tends to make it so your bones don't recover as fast anymore, right? And that's what happened to Deshaun Watson as well. It's fascinating to hear these guys talk about Deshaun Watson and the what if to Atlanta as if it is not something that terrifies Atlanta Falcons fans, that it almost happened. Like, they're like, yeah, Atlanta, whoo, it could have been lit. We could have had Deshaun, me, and Leonard Fournette in 2022. Does anybody who's an Atlanta Falcon fan want that? It's just interesting how disconnected they still are from the reality of what Deshaun Watson is. And maybe that's something I'm underestimating, because I've been watching Deshaun Watson since he came here in Cleveland. And I've given Deshaun Watson a fair trial while he was here. Go back and listen to how I talked about him in 2022. Go back and listen to how I talked about him in 2023. I was being more fair to Deshaun Watson than most people were. Because at the end of the day, as much as I wasn't a fan of Deshaun and what he was accused of, I want the Browns to be good. And I want to cover what's actually happening on the field. 2024 comes around, it's obvious that Deshaun's not going to help the team be better. Well, you got to do what you got to do. I'm still being fair. The reality to Deshaun is just he's not good. That's the fair opinion to have about him. He's not helpful to the team. It's not hate, just the reality of where he is. Me going through all of that over the last few years has made it so that I'm not living in some kind of fantasy land of what Deshaun used to be and thinking that that can be recovered. I have watched closely why he's not who he was in 2020 anymore. And I've watched closely enough to know that him returning to that form, based on what we've seen from other players, is virtually impossible. Him returning to a form where he's a starting quarterback in the NFL again, that would be a miracle. That's not impossible, but it would be a miracle. It would be spectacular, given what he's had to overcome over the last few years, physically, mentally, all those things. There's a reason why ownership is almost talking about him in the past tense. I am under no delusion with this whole Deshaun Watson thing, but it is fascinating to see how much delusion still exists with this Deshaun Watson situation amongst people who maybe are closer to Deshaun, right? Maybe are friends with him, fans of Deshaun in the past, or players who admired him when he was good. There's still a level of delusion there. Now, here's another thing I'll touch on. We're hearing this story about how Deshaun Watson was recruiting for Atlanta. I have yet to hear a story about how Deshaun Watson was recruiting for Cleveland. Now, I don't know if that didn't happen. I'm just pointing that out. Like, there's not a lot of stories about Deshaun recruiting to Cleveland. I think maybe Jadeveon Clowney came here because he was friends with Deshaun, but I think that was Jadeveon's decision. I don't think Deshaun was recruiting him. Like, did Deshaun recruit for Cleveland as much as he was recruiting for Atlanta? I think that matters because a lot of people have questions about if that contract made him not really work as hard anymore. And if he was recruiting in Atlanta, but wasn't recruiting in Cleveland, might be something to that. Anyways, just wanted to talk about that because I think the wider discussion about why it is that Deshaun failed is much more interesting than could it have been Atlanta? Yeah, it could have been Atlanta. The Browns dropped the bag, Jimmy Haslam specifically, to avoid that. We all know that if we've been paying attention closely. But why it failed, I think, is just infinitely more interesting. And I hope that, as we get further removed from this, that there can be some legitimate curiosity and journalism done on what happened there so that we can see that story in like a documentary or something that can be truly insightful. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.